that. There's no transcendent orientation that pops you outside of the realm of tyranny in some real sense. So, and the biblical narrative insists that that is not the case. So, it's a pretty dismal view, that it's just a choice among tyrannies.
But to pick up Dennis's great point of the two tyrannies, that Lord Acton, the famous saying, all power tends to corrupt. Power oppresses the weak. That's the obvious one, and it happens here. But it corrupts the powerful.
Right.
And that's what happens to Pharaoh.
Yeah, and there is such a thing as corruption, right? So that's an absolute reality, the corruption that power tends to produce. Of course, that's partly why the Pharaoh's heart is hardened as well. And yeah, it's a very germane observation that slavery corrupts the slaver as much as the slave, or perhaps you could say perhaps even more, right? Because it incites within the slaver something like a Luciferian presumption, and it entices him for instrumental reasons into denying the divinity of someone else, and then acting in the manner of someone who denies divinity per se, right? Absolutely pernicious and corrosive. So, and the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the birthing stools, if it be a son, then you shall kill him. And that's that instrumental usage that you were talking about before.
There is a huge issue here. The Hebrew is completely indeterminative whether the midwives were Hebrews or not. Mialdota Ivriot, and I'm not going to throw out Hebrew often. I feel very self-conscious at all. But for those who know Hebrew, they will know what I'm talking about. It can be the Hebrew midwives or the midwives of the Hebrews. There is no possible way, based on those two words, to know which it is. I am convinced, and Jewish tradition doesn't agree with me. I mean post-biblical Jewish tradition. The Torah, I think, does agree with me, but c'est la vie. I believe they were Egyptian. I do not believe he would have ordered Hebrew midwives to murder every Hebrew boy.
Do you think there's a purposeful ambiguity there to leave it up to question?
That's beautiful. It may well be. That's right. Well, it certainly is. The Hebrew is ambiguous. That is correct.
I mean, if a tyranny gets corrupt enough, then people turn against themselves.
That's right. However, just on logical grounds, when he gets angry at them for not doing it, it would be odd he'd get angry at Hebrews for not killing Hebrews. But my biggest proof you're coming to, where it says that they feared God and didn't listen to Pharaoh. Again, that's one of my favorite lines in the whole Bible. You either fear humans or you fear God. Fear God is the root of freedom and wisdom. Mm-hmm. And the word for God is not Jehovah or Yahweh, it's Elohim. So when Jews fear God, it's generally fear Yahweh, and in this case it's fear Elohim, and the universal word for God, and I am convinced that they are Egyptians.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Are you looking to dive deeper into the entire Bible? Look no further than the Hallow app, the #1 prayer app in the world, featuring an entire category of content to help you dive deeper into prayer and meditation on the Bible. By studying the Bible, you'll gain a deeper appreciation for the power of storytelling, symbolism, and metaphor, enriching your understanding of literature across different genres. Go through the Bible in a year with Father Mike Schmitz, or hear the Bible narrated by renowned actors like Jonathan Rumi from The Chosen or Jim Caviezel from The Sound of Freedom. Hallow has over 10,000 audio-guided prayers, meditations, and music to deepen your understanding and knowledge of the Bible. The Hallow app also helps you connect with a community of like-minded individuals, sharing experiences, insights, and encouragement along your path to spiritual growth. Download the app for free at hallow.com/exodus. You can set reminders and track your progress along the way. Enrich your education and nurture your mind and soul today. Download the Hallow app at hallow.com/exodus. That's hallow.com/exodus. hallow.com/exodus for an exclusive 3-month free trial of all 6,000 plus prayers and meditations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Douglas, do you have any sense of what it means in this passage and more broadly that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom and an appropriate, let's say, precondition for freedom. Why do you think it's conceptualized as fear?
Well, I think there's a proper fear that in this case I think is linked to transcendence. So there's the fear of the tyrant, which is normal and natural, and which we are all subject to, but there should be a greater fear, i.e. the fear of the transcendent,
violating it,
violating that.
Right,
yes.
right.
And of course, this is why the postmodern attack on traditional Western culture is so dangerous. I mean, of course, it goes back to the very origins of Western culture with the sophists, but the idea that there is no such thing as an objective moral order, and there certainly is no transcendent basis for that, that would make this whole narrative unintelligible.
It also makes the tyrant the final arbiter in some real sense, right?
It becomes justification.
You know, people have asked me, and I'm always embarrassed by this, but people have commented on my courage for speaking up, so to speak, and I think you don't actually understand the situation. I'm not courageous in my speaking up. I'm more afraid of the alternative. And part of the reason for that was that when I was a clinician, and I spent thousands, tens of thousands of hours dealing with people's serious problems, one of the things I learned was, and I really learned this, was that you don't get away with anything. And so you might think you can bend the fabric of reality and that you can treat people instrumentally and that you can bow to the tyrant without and violate your conscience without cost, but that is just not the case. You will pay the piper. When you pay, you might not even notice the causal connection between the sin and the payment. And one of the things you do in psychotherapy is people's lives take a twist and they go very badly wrong. And when you walk back through people's lives with them, you come to these choice points where you meet the devil at the crossroads and you find out that, well, you went left, let's say, and downhill when you should have gone right and uphill, and now you're paying the price for that. And you don't impose that as a therapist. You help people discover that or rediscover it, because they often know at the time that they've made an error and then forget and then rationalize the forgetting and then, and then multiply the lies. And so,
but that's tremendously difficult to do within a secular frame. I mean, I think you found ways of doing that. I think, Jordan, I'm thinking actually of somebody like Viktor Frankl and his idea that sense of the logos, of a kind of a meaning, is what gives you a kind of existential drive and helped him survive the horrors of the Holocaust. But more typically, it's religion. It's a sort of religious framing that it gives people the power to resist tyranny.
Well, that religious framing seems in part, even if you think about it in a secular sense, is that like when maybe you're making a choice to do the instrumental and easy thing, but there's part of you that knows that that's wrong. Not always. Sometimes you just make a mistake because you don't know, but often you know, and yet you pick the easier path, let's say. And the part of the manner in which God is portrayed throughout the biblical corpus, but I would say in traditions around the world, as that phenomenon that alerts you to your own misbehavior. And it is really something, again, I really learned from Jung, contra Freud in some real sense, is that, and contra Nietzsche, who believed that maybe we could create our own values, is that there's something within that is transcendent, because it isn't only in you, it's in everyone in some fundamental and real sense, plus it's eternal in some fundamental and real sense, and it calls you on your misbehavior.
But don't you think our culture is approaching a kind of crisis point? In other words, the postmodernists, everything's constructive, truth is not there, etc., etc. There's no reality except what you make it. But of course, truth is always about something, as C.S. Lewis used to say, and what it's about is reality.
Well, there's this insistence.
And people are going to hit the wall at point after point today
on the postmodern
because there is reality.
It's as if we're insisting that there is nothing other than Towers of Babel. There isn't anything they're being built against or shielding us from. It's just one Tower of Babel after another, and it can be. And I can't help but see a real tyrannical demand for power in that, because one of the things I've often wondered is, well, why are the constructivists, the radical constructivists, so insistent that there's no core human nature when really the evidence that there's a core human nature is pretty damn strong, particularly perhaps if you think biologically. So why this insistence? And I can't help but think it's because, well, you want to remake people in the image of your ideology, and so you have to insist that they have no intrinsic nature, because otherwise the pesky realities of the transcendent nature get in the way of your Luciferian presumptions.
There's no God, no truth. There is only power.
Right. Well, that's the Dostoevskian issue in some real sense, isn't it?
I want to pick up on what you said, Dennis, a little before, and I want to propose that there might be a very important narrative reason why the midwives are Hebrew in this case. And the reason I think it's a good lesson for us today, which is that the tyrant is empowering women to kill their men. That is what the tyrant is doing. And he's doing it in order to feminize the Hebrews. And I think that
No wonder you get in trouble.
but I think that it's important, and the reason why they won't do it is because they fear God, is because they're able to see beyond the power that the Pharaoh is handing them at this moment. And I think that when you think that couldn't happen, like in a people, it's like, look around you, we're seeing it happen.
Well, it's so interesting, because it also implies that, well, it's in the best interest of the tyrant to dispense with those figures who might pose a threat to the tyranny.
Right.
And those would be tough men, right? Because they're the ones who keep the real
That's such an intelligent point that it reinforces your reaction to what I said. Maybe the text is purposefully ambiguous about whether or not they were Hebrews or Egyptians.
Yeah.
And you've swayed me.
Well, I've seen that purposeful ambiguity in other texts.
So let me just say, I know I identify a bias in me, and I will reveal it. I'm very, I hope, self-aware.
Good. So the first learning episode has actually occurred.
Yeah, exactly. The Torah goes out of its way, this is one of the fundamental beliefs of my life, to portray non-Jews positively and Jews negatively. It's one of the reasons I believe it's a divine author. If Jews had made up the Torah, they would have come across much more positively. They come across as awful, as a general rule. And non-Jews from...
So it's anti-propaganda.
Anti-propaganda, certainly. Noah is a non-Jew. Of course, there are no Jews at that time. But Moses' father-in-law, who is the great advisor to Moses, is a Midianite priest. The daughter of Pharaoh is a non-Jew. She saves Moses, and it is just a consistent pattern. And I thought that the midwives was part of that pattern. As I say, God is ethic-centered, not ethnic-centered.
Okay.
And this is taken as the first civil disobedience, isn't it?
That's right. That's
the first example of someone standing against a crime against humanity. And I don't come down either way, but I think you can make a strong point for Dennis's.
Right, so that it implies that the relationship with God is actually what enables people to have the strength to stand up against the tyrant.
Yeah. If you think of the Nuremberg trial, they didn't actually have a basis for what they were saying. There's no international law.
Right.
They were reaching, and maybe the same thing is intuitively they know.
Well, that's certainly what Solzhenitsyn thought about the Nuremberg trials, is he believed that the fact that the Nazi atrocities were regarded as wrong, independent of cultural context, he thought that was a signal achievement of the 20th century, because it reestablished not so much the existence of good, but definitely the existence of evil. And that was something I found unbelievably convincing, because I thought, well, you've got a real conundrum here. It's like, was what the Nazis did evil or not? Because those are the alternatives. And if it wasn't, it's like, okay, well, you can move ahead on that presumption, or you can accept that it was evil in a transcendent sense, because that's what the Nuremberg trials were about. And then the terrible implication of that, in some sense, is that if evil genuinely exists, then its opposite genuinely exists, because it's not going to exist without its opposite. And so, as soon as you accept the reality of the evil of Auschwitz, you're in a metaphysical world in some sense, because you have to simultaneously posit the existence of a transcendent good that's at least the opposite of that. And part of what I've been striving for 40 years, I would say, is to identify what is the opposite of the spirit that produced Auschwitz. And some of it Solzhenitsyn detailed out so nicely. It's the spirit of truth, and Frankl, it's the spirit of meaning, and I think you can make a strong case that it's the spirit of love, and it's some amalgam of those three things, and that doesn't exhaust it, and it's the spirit of play and voluntary association and freedom, all things that are stressed in the biblical narrative. And
where there is no vision, a people perisheth, as in Proverbs. And I think that's very important, this notion of, contemplation. We'll come to that in particularly chapter 3, but this sense of a vision of goodness as having an inspiring quality. And
it is a vision too, and not just a mere verbal conceptualization, right? Which is why the artistic endeavor is so important, and the architectural endeavor, because it's not merely propositional, that vision. One of the things I learned with my students and with my clinical clients was that, and I helped them do this, was to help people develop a literal vision for their life. It's like, okay, if you could have what you wanted to arm you against the slings and arrows of fate, let's say, or to at least defend you against it, in principle, if you could have what you needed and wanted, what would that look like? That's a kind of prayer. It's like knock and the door will open, and ask and you will receive. It's like, okay, you could conceivably have what you wanted, but you have to specify what it is, and you have to have a vision of it. And part of what the humanities education should do, and the religious education certainly, is to flesh out a vision of a mode of being and a mode of perception that would justify suffering, or maybe even more than justify it. So,
you could say, I suppose, that if theists are faced with the problem of evil, atheists are confronted with the problem of good. Try how to make sense of goodness, how to make sense of what it is that drives their moral indignation and their great social revolutions. I mean, one of the most terrifying moments in the Nuremberg trials was when the Nazis advanced the defense that this was simply victor's justice, that they had not really broken any laws. They were scrupulous legislators, after all, and following orders. That's right. And so sort of Western notions of justice found themselves staring into the abyss. How is it that we're going to make sense of our deep intuition that this is evil of an absolute kind? And I think this is one of the great, as a matter of historical fact, one of the most important motivating factors behind the emergence of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, of course, in 1948, and with it the entire sort of rights-based regime of morality that is with us still, that has proliferated and expanded.
So the problem on the atheist front is, on what basis can these things can be claimed as self-evident? What's the grounding for that if it's just not? And the postmodern critique of that in some sense is that, well, all that nonsense talk about rights and freedoms is just instrumental camouflage hiding a more fundamental will to power and desire to oppress. Right.
And the worry is that the only answer available in a purely sort of secular framework would be because this document tells us that this is wrong, or this document tells us that this is right.
Right, so that becomes part of the social contract, and in which case the problem emerges immediately again. That's just an arbitrary social contract.
The solution effectively carries within it the sort of replicates the very problem that it was trying to solve.
That's partly why I'm often interested in talking to biologists. I've talked to Frans de Waal most recently, and he's a primatologist who's worked on elucidating the principles by which chimpanzees organize their social hierarchies, and the Marxist, really, and classic biological take on that for simple-minded biologists is that the chimps use will to power, right? The alpha chimp is the most powerful, most dominant, meanest, roughest, boxer, oppressor. And de Waal's work, conducted over about 30 years, has showed that that's not just wrong, it's anti-true in some sense. So it's exactly the opposite of the reality. Now and then you can get a chimp who rules by power, but it destabilizes the troop emotionally and socially, and his reign tends to be short, brutal, and meet an extremely violent and murderous end. It's not an effective strategy, and what DeWaal has shown that is to stabilize the iterative interactions within a troop. The alpha male, who sometimes can be the smallest male in the troop, has to be more reciprocal than any other individual in the troop. And so the basis of chimpanzee power is peacemaking, reciprocity, and stable long-term social relations between males and between the more authoritative males and females.
But does that allow us to use the language, does that analysis allow us to use the language of good, or rather, are we only licensed by DeWaal's analysis to speak of adaptive value, reproductive fitness?
Well, I'm kind of hoping they go like this, because, the idea of the reciprocity that allows the alpha chimps to maintain their sovereignty across time is something very much like treat your neighbor as if he's yourself. And so I think that there's no reason to assume that the ethic, if it's transcendent, couldn't emerge out of the material and descend in some sense from the spiritual at the same,
without reducing goodness to a mere morality, to a mere survival mechanism.
right? Well, and it's not so mere either, right? If it's a survival mechanism, it's pretty damn deep. And we could also think, if we were expanding our notion of what constitutes the biological, we could also think of the patterns of behavior that are most germane to our survival as transcendent. They're embodied, they're instinctual, they're outside the propositional domain.
Although often it's the case that we think of the highest moral act as extinction, laying down one's life, that is surrendering our opportunities for survival and the survival of our kin.
Yeah, well, right. So there are definitely times where mere proximal survival seems to contradict an even deeper instinct. I mean, I would say that the willingness it's tricky, right? Because my wife was talking to, I think, Janice Fee